effective teaching strategies. As I said, I am Dr. Martina Debo. I'm the founder and CEO of Sion Educational Services, which is an organization that's dedicated to educational excellence. I have been a teacher or an educator now, it says for over 35 years, but it's closer to 40 years now. And I'm really determined to share the little knowledge or the little insights, the gems of knowledge that I've gleaned over the years and share it with all my fellow educators. So let's just jump right in. Instructional excellence is the right of every student. I truly believe that every student has a right to go into the classroom and expect that their teachers will have prepared and will be at an excellence level so that we're not just giving them whatever comes to mind at the time. And in order to be prepared, there are several elements. The first element is your classroom management. You have to have good, strong classroom management. Without classroom management, you're fighting a losing battle because what will happen is that you'll be spending most of your time putting out fires. And you don't want to do that. You want to be able to present to your students the things that you've prepared for your students. So um, we're going to first of all go into classroom management. Then we're going to talk about some elements about child-centered teaching before we go into cognitive um, setup, 21st century framework, and the use of technology in the classroom. We're also now going to also transition into critical thinking. So this is going to be pretty packed, and I probably am going to chop it up into different parts in order to present it to you. What is classroom management? That's the first thing. When I ask a teacher, what do you think classroom management is? Maybe this would be a good point for you to pause the video and just jot down what you think classroom management looks like. Okay, I'm hoping that you've paused the video and that you have written something down and maybe you've had time to discuss it in your groups. When you go into a classroom, do you see a classroom that's active with the children kind of walking around and talking to each other? Would that say to you that that's a poorly managed classroom? Or do you see, when you go into a classroom, you see the children all sitting down, all listening to the teacher, all taking down notes? Would you think that's a well managed classroom? It's up to you to decide what your classroom management style is because we each have different, just as the students each have different learning modalities, as teachers, we each have different teaching modalities. So, what is classroom management? It's effective discipline. For example, I have a friend who was a teacher, who was a colleague of mine, and when you go into her classroom, all the children are sitting down watching her, and she's teaching them and they're well behaved. It's very disciplined. That's her management style. When you come into my classroom, you'll find children working in groups, probably working on a project, talking to each other, interacting, getting up, going to different places. But the minute I need them to pay attention, I have a signal. In one of my classes, it was, and they would all immediately stop and give me their attention. Or sometimes I would say, 1, 2, 3, back to me. And they would stop and give me their attention. So those are two extreme forms of effective discipline within the classroom, but they're both effective management styles. It's just that one person prefers one style to another. She would not be able to deal with my style because she doesn't do well with people moving around, and I wouldn't be able to do well with her style because my philosophy for education is active interaction and collaboration. So the next thing you need for an effective classroom is to be prepared. You need to prepare for your classroom. You cannot just run into the classroom willy-nilly, not know what you're going to teach. You've just made copies. You really haven't thought it through. If you function that way, your classroom is going to be very haphazard. because you're going to be frazzled a lot of times. You don't know what you're doing, and it comes across. So in order to have a good classroom management style, you have to have a good lesson preparation or class preparation style. So you have to begin with being a prepared teacher. You also have to have a way to motivate your students to want to behave, to want to learn, to be excited about learning. If you motivate your students, they're going to want to focus on what you've given them to do. For example, in a science class, I have children making uh, using dry ice and water to make it's kind they think it's steam, but it's really not. It's just vapor, and they're using that vapor to create some kind of a scene that's linked to the literature that we're studying. We were studying Macbeth at the time, so they had the steam coming out that would show the steam coming out of the cauldron when Macbeth went to visit the witches. Anyway, so they were excited about that. They were engrossed in that. When children are engaged in the learning, you have very little management problems. The classroom management also provides a safe, comfortable learning environment. That means that your environment should not lend itself to accidents, to children tripping over things, to materials that could damage them. If you have that in your classroom, then you're going to likely have a lot of accidents that you will have to sort out. I had a class once where I had a little boy who really enjoyed, teasing the girls. Now it was my role as the classroom manager, as it were, to make sure that I had my eye on him for the sake of the girls, because he didn't do it to hurt them. He just enjoyed teasing them. So, and that was not a safe environment for the girls. It wasn't a comfortable learning environment for the girls. So I had to make sure that he was close to me and I had my eye on him. That way I was able to safely manage my classroom. You have to build the student's self-esteem. When you have a classroom that's well managed, your students know what they're supposed to do and they do it. And so you have less of this behavior intervention. Stop doing this, don't do this. When you're not getting on the children about every little thing, they have a sense of self-worth, self-efficacy, and ultimately self-esteem. You want to build their self-esteem. That's what it's all about. You want to build their self-esteem. And a well classroom management also starts with you as a creative, imaginative lesson designer. When you're creating something that's imaginative for the children, they're going to be engaged in what you're doing. There was a time when I was teaching coordinate pairs, XY coordinates. And what I did was I had the children design things on graph paper and then use the XY coordinates for them to do needlework. So when they had this colored thread, and every time they put the needle in the XY coordinate and brought it out the other one and put it in another one, it created a pattern on the opposite side of the graph paper, which they had glued some black construction paper on. So the colored thread created this pattern, and the graph paper gave them a knowledge of XY coordinates. And that, for them, they were so involved in creating their patterns. I didn't have to deal with you're not on task, what are you doing? Because they wanted to see their patterns, they wanted to share their patterns. So you have to be creative when you're creating your patterns or when you're creating your lessons. And I say that because a lot of teachers just feel that they're just going to teach the objectives. And I keep telling people, you don't teach subjects, you don't teach objectives, you teach children. You teach children. And when you teach children and you engage the children in the learning process, they will not be they're less likely to continue to act up. It's different for everyone. Remember at the beginning I said my friend had a a classroom management structure that was more structured. It was more, it was more traditional. I had a classroom management structure that was more project based, and it was more collaborative. But we both had management systems, and that's where you want to be. It has to be different for everyone. Why? Because your teaching styles are different. My teaching style, my teaching philosophy is based on the 4 C's. I believe in collaboration, in creativity. I believe in critical thinking and communication. And I incorporate all of that into my lesson. Some teachers don't feel comfortable with children um, collaborating and talking and moving around. So their management systems can be very different. And you have to determine what your management system is based on your teaching style, your personality and attitudes, and your student population. There was a class I had that had a high population of Black boys. They are kinesthetic learners. They cannot sit still. They have to be able to get up and do things. Then there was a time I had a classroom population that was mostly Hispanic. And there was also a time when I had a classroom population that was mostly white. And their behavior styles were different. The white students were more apt to be able to sit down and ask, and they had longer attention spans. I'm not saying this in a derogatory sense, I'm just saying that's what they were. Um, my Black students were more kinesthetic. And then also, when I'm talking about student population, you also need to talk about the learning styles within your population. You have to know which students are kinesthetic learners, which students are visual learners, which ones are auditory learners, and which ones are a combination of of all three, or even more. You have to know which students get along with each other. You have to know which students need extra help. All of that must be factored in to your classroom management style. Not all management strategies are effective for every teacher. I've talked about this before. What was effective for me would not have been effective for my friend. She would not have been able to manage it because she would get frazzled by all the movements and all the talking. For me, when students are collaborating and they're communicating about the project I've given them, for me that is something that's music to my ears. It gives me joy. So what you need to do is to try different strategies to see what works for you. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to pause the video, and in your groups, or if you're not in groups, if you're working individually, take a few minutes to write down what you think your classroom management style would be based on your personality and your teaching style, and what you put in place to make sure that your classroom is well managed. But do try some different strategies, because you might think it's one thing and it might be something else. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to pause this video and just think about or share within your group what you think your classroom strategy would be. Okay, welcome back. So why is classroom management important? That's something that we need to talk about. Why is it important? Because what happens is, when you have a classroom that's functioning like a well-oiled machine, where the children are engaged, where learning is happening, it gives you a sense of satisfaction, and it gives the children a sense of enjoyment, because they're not depending on you to manage to control some students, and they're also not depending on the students to to um, to realize that they have to cooperate. They cooperate naturally because they are engaged and they know what the law, they know what the rules are, they know what the activities are, they know your expectations. All of those things are important. Classroom management issues are the highest concern for beginning teachers, and not just for beginning teachers. There are some teachers who never quite manage the art of classroom management. They never figure out what works for them. They never figure out that it's not a one size fits all, that they have to adjust it a little bit based on the population of students they have. They just never figure these things out. And I'll give you a good example. When I was a director in one of the schools that I taught in, I was a summer school director, and I had this teacher who, at the end of each day at 3 o'clock, would come running to me and start crying that she wanted to quit. Well, I'd be able to talk her out of it, and she'd go back the next day. Well, one day she came in and she was covered from head to toe in blue paint. Apparently, a child had thrown blue paint at her, and she didn't know what she was supposed to do. And and again, that's because some rules haven't been put in place. If And I asked her, I said, what if that child had thrown blue paint on another child? What would you have done? And she listed all the things that she would have done. I said, well, you are why do you think you're less worthy of the logical consequences of that child? If that's what you would have done, then go and do it. Make sure that you know that as a teacher, this is your classroom. You are the manager of this classroom. You are the leader of this learning. Principles for successful classroom management. There are many. I won't even begin to pretend that this is an exhaustive list of things that you can do for successful classroom management. Not even slightly. But these are some that you might want to think about. Deal with disruptive behaviors. Don't just let it go on and on and on. In as much as you set your rules, in as much as you've got your rewards and your consequences in place, when disruptive behavior occurs, deal with it, manage it, and minimize off-task behavior. Because what happens is, if one child gets away with being disruptive, or the whole class has to stop because of one child, then a child who is seeking attention sees that as a source of attention getting. It now becomes an attention getting device. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have strategies in place that will allow the children to know that you're not going to accept that behavior. One of the things I do, or I used to do when I was in the classroom, is I would walk close to the child. I would use proximity. My very presence was enough to minimize that behavior. Or I would look at the child, make sure I made eye contact and do this, that I'm watching you. Or I would walk past the child and just put my hand on the child's shoulder. Most times that was enough to recorrect or redirect a child. If for some reason you have a child that continues to be disruptive, then maybe a conference. You call the child to your table, or you call the child to a corner. You have to decide what works for you. Calling the child to my table worked for me because most of my children would be working independently in groups. So I could ask the child to come to my table. And an important thing you need to know when you're dealing with disruptive behavior is you need to know the why. Why is this child behaving this way? Is it because they feel inadequate? Have you given them a task that they cannot do? Is it because they want attention? Is it because they want power? Children misbehave for different reasons, and that's a whole nother training. I have a whole training on just classroom management behaviors and how to identify why a child is misbehaving. But you need to know that not every child misbehaves simply because they're naughty. Some children actually have a need for attention because they're not getting it at home, or their self-esteem is so low that they cannot continue, or the work you've given them is just too hard, or it's not, or the other extreme, the work you've given them is too easy, it's not challenging enough. When I had a class of gifted and talented students, I found that I had to constantly and consistently provide work for them that was challenging. I had my fourth graders. That would be primary four. I had my primary four students. I had some who were so advanced that they were doing a middle school algebra, and I had to incorporate that into the lesson because learning is not a one size fits all. You have to know that. Learning is not a one size fits all. You cannot say because I've created my lesson plan, therefore this is all I'm going to teach. If during the process of the lesson you recognize that there's a child who has finished before everyone else, or who isn't engaged, then it's your responsibility as the teacher to engage that child, to decide what you can do to make the child more actively engaged in your lesson. One of the things I had was I had a thing called time on your hands. And when if the children finished early, I gave them some really, really challenging options on their hands. At the beginning of the class, at the beginning of the year, they would draw their hand on a sheet of paper, and then in each of these digits, they would have different activities that they could do as sponge activities if they finished whatever else I had given them to do. And those sponge activities were very, very challenging. And there were things they enjoyed doing, so they wanted to do it. Teach students to manage their own behavior. Please, 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 please. Teach students to manage their own behavior. And the way you do that is when they start to misbehave. We had a thing in one of the schools where I taught, where the teacher would say, or the adult would say, what are you doing? What are you supposed to be doing? When are you going to get started? And that was the redirecting mechanism for the entire school. Everyone, if you saw a child running down the hallway, you would stop that child, and instead of saying, don't run, you would say, what are you doing? I'm running. What are you supposed to be doing? I'm supposed to be walking. When are you going to get started? Or if you have a child who is supposed to be doing some work and is kind of just daydreaming, what are you doing? Nothing. What are you supposed to be doing? This work. When are you going to get started? It's important that you have the children manage their own behavior. A good way to also do it is to have them have reflection journals. And I had one set of my students where they were allowed the 5 minutes before the end of class, they were allowed to reflect on their day. Actually, it was closer to 10 minutes. They were allowed to reflect on their day. What did I learn today? What don't I understand? What would I like to ask the teacher, or what would I like to ask someone to help me about? And they had those reflection journals that I could look through, um, and I was able to give them feedback. Sometimes they'd write something that's really personal that they wouldn't want me to read, and they would fold over the side of the page, so I would know that that's a personal reflection that has nothing to do with the learning, and I would skip over that. Now, I remember I remember at one parent teacher workshop, no, not parent teacher workshop, parent development workshop, I shared that little gem that there was a page that they would turn over, and I would know that they didn't want me to read this. And some parents were irate. How can a child have things that they don't want you to read? Well, again, that was my management style. I had no problems with doing that. Some people would have a problem doing that. Parents might have a problem doing that. I didn't have a problem doing that. And because I didn't have a problem doing that, the children felt safe. Remember, give a safe environment. The children felt safe enough to write things in their reflection journal that I was able to use to meet their needs. Students learn to be on task and engaged in the learning activities that you have planned for them. Again, it all comes back to you. You are the manager. When you're in your own home and you have your own children, and you want to do something, you sit down and you plan it. Anything that's not planned, anything that's haphazard, has the possibility, the opportunity to go wrong. Whatever will go wrong, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And so you have to make sure that your lessons are well planned. So your lesson plans that you have to write, your lesson diaries that you have to write, your lesson notes that you have to write, are not just because people want you to do a whole bunch of work. They're because that's the skeleton for your professional performance. You are a professional. Let's face it, if you go to a doctor's office and the doctor has never planned how he's going to interact with you as a patient, or you're going to have surgery and the surgeon has never planned how the surgery will commence, would you feel safe? Would you feel comfortable? Would you even go back there? I know I wouldn't. It's more natural to be off task than to be on task. So if in order to keep people on task, you have to make sure it's planned, structured, and well laid out. Okay, techniques for better classroom control. And this is something I want you to think about very, very carefully. Focus attention on the entire class. Make sure that your eyes are moving and you're seeing what's going on. I was in a class once, I was observing in a class. It was one of the times when I was contracted to do classroom evaluations for one of my private schools, one of my clients. And the teacher he had done his lesson and he was presenting it. It was a very teacher-centered lesson. So the teacher was doing most of the talking. And there was one little boy at the back, and he spent the entire time looking out of the window. As part of my evaluation system, what I do is I count the number of times a particular child answers a question, so I can do a percentage. And in this class, I think we had 22 students. Of the 22 students, 11 students answered questions. It was the same 11 students that answered the questions. And of those 11 students, only 3 answered most of the questions. But the class was very, very well controlled. The children did not act up. So there wasn't a lot of student engagement, even though the classrooms looked very, very controlled. So as a teacher, you've got to focus on the entire class, not just the handful that you're getting the response that you're seeking from. Because you're responsible for the whole child, right? You're responsible for the whole class. When students are chattering, don't start talking over them. I remember I told you that in my classrooms, children would be walking around, they'd be working in groups, they'd be talking, they'd be discussing, they'd be communicating. But when I wanted to give them instructions, when I wanted to talk to them, I had a signal that told them that they needed to stop and give me their attention. In one of the classes, it was, right? And they would stop. There was another class where I would simply say, ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention. And they'd look at me. Then there's another class, a much younger class, when I would say, 1, 2, 3, back to me. And they would come back to me. So, I varied it based on the population of the children I was dealing with. But I never, ever started talking over children. And if I'm in the middle of an explanation and children start talking, I just be quiet. I just stop talking, hands together, and I'm watching them. And as soon as they realize that I have stopped talking, there's a hush that goes across the classroom because they know what my expectations are. Silence can be very effective. It's just what I told you just now. If they're off task or they're talking too much or something, and I go 1, 2, 3 back to me and they don't come back to me immediately, I just stand up and I just absolutely silent. And they know that means they need to come back to me. Another very good, effective way when you're teaching, when you're doing direct instruction and children start to, is to lower your voice. When you lower your voice and you're talking much more softly, the children keep quiet so they can listen to what you're saying. It's a natural reflex, it's a natural response. Direct your instruction so that students know what's going to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to do an activity. You're going to split up into your groups. I have a game we're going to play first, and then we're going to do some social studies. Make sure that they know what's going to happen. When my children go into their learning centers, on the wall, clearly marked, will be what they're going to do in that center, the objectives that are going to be covered in that center. Make sure they know what's going on. Monitor groups of students to check progress. Don't just assume that what you're teaching, they are learning. I usually say, if you are teaching and they're not learning, then you're just talking. If you've given them an activity and they're just doing it, but they're not learning from that activity, then they're just playing. So you have to monitor your groups. If you're working with groups of students, you have to walk around. You have to ask them prompting questions. You have to, for example, if they're doing, let's say they're doing a science project, and they have to gather data and arrive at a conclusion. And you're walking around and you'll say, ask them a question. Is there anything that this data would lead you to conclude? Have you arrived at a conclusion yet? What about this one? This one, I can see that all your data is at this end, but this one kind of looks as if it's a bit skewed. Do you know why? Do you have a justification for this? Whatever you're doing, if it's math and you've given them a word problem, you've given them a project that has problems that they have to solve, you want them to be able to explain, to articulate your reasoning, their reasoning, sorry, to articulate their reasoning. You're all the time you're thinking about using those higher order thinking skills. And I'll get to that when I start talking about cognitive development. But you want them to use those critical thinking skills. So if it's literature, if you're telling them a story, you throw out a question that will make them think. And as you're throwing out those questions, you're monitoring the groups. Which groups are responding? Which groups look lost? If you have a group of students that just don't seem to get it, then you would know how to adjust your instruction, or how to adjust what you're teaching to meet their needs. Because as I said before, it's when students feel lost or feel inadequate to perform the tasks you've given them, that's one of the times that they start to act up. Move around the classroom so students have to pay attention. They don't know where you're going to be next. You're here 1 minute, you're here another minute, you're here another minute. So they don't just sit in front of the classroom. That's something that really always bothers me when I go in to observe a classroom, that the teacher's just sitting in front of the classroom, and the children are supposed to be working, but the teacher isn't walking around to monitor. As a teacher, you're supposed to be monitoring the children's work. Give students non-verbal clues, not just verbal clues, non-verbal clues. Like, for example, a child is almost there. The child is explaining something, and you're going, yes, okay. Can you say this a little bit different? I think I've got what you said. Can you just explain it a little bit? Use your body, lean in, do the thumbs up, clap, do the high five. Give them non-verbal clues. I used to give non-verbal clues even to redirect. Remember I told you that I'd go like this? I'm watching you. Or in other words, what are you doing? What are you supposed to be doing? When are you going to get started? Give those verbal clues, those non-verbal clues, and let them the children get used to it. Another thing I used to do was, in the middle of a class, especially with math, it happened more with math than anything else. if we were discussing something, on the occasions when I was doing direct teaching, I would say something like yes, no, maybe so, and yes, this is no, and this is maybe so. So I would allow the students to write up against their chest so that they wouldn't have to feel embarrassed. So I'll say, do you understand? And if somebody goes like this up against their chest, I would note that that child needs more work on that topic. If the children do this, that means I get it. If the children do this, that means I will check to see if they actually do get it, or maybe they still need more work. But I always had non-verbal clues. Engage in low-profile intervention of disruptions. Remember I said one of the ways you could do it is to walk up to the child. Proximity is a really good motivator to redirect the child. Put your hand on the child's shoulder is another one. That I'm watching you is another one. Just it's up to you how you want to do it, but make it low profile so that it doesn't disrupt the whole class. That's the important thing. You don't want to reinforce bad behavior by giving them attention. And also, you don't want to disrupt your class. You don't want to disrupt the flow of the class. Make sure your classroom is comfortable and safe. I said that before. Make sure the classroom is comfortable and safe. Don't have a classroom that's that's untidy. You've got things falling all over the place. Just make sure that you've got a classroom that when the children walk in, they feel comfortable, they feel safe. Okay, so effective and efficient classrooms must have rules. You have to have those rules. The student and the teacher can create the rules together. I used to do that all the time. At the beginning of the class, I would have at the beginning of the school year, I would have a brainstorming session where the students would come together and they would say all the things that they think we need to pay attention to for our classroom rules, and I would gather them all together in broad topics and then come up with between 5 and 6 rules. I never did more than 6 rules because you want the number of rules to be something that they can remember. And you also remember you have to have rules that are expressed as positive statements. Instead of saying, don't be disruptive or don't talk when I'm talking, you would say something like, always pay attention. So that always pay attention covers a whole slew of activities. Or be respectful. There was one school, the same school that had the what are you doing, what you're supposed to be doing, and when will you get started. They had 5 rules. Come prepared to learn, come prepared to help and be helped. No, come prepared to ask for help, come prepared to offer help, come prepared, be respectful to others, and have fun. Those were their 5 rules, and it actually covered everything. Because if a child is hurting someone, then that's not respectful. If a child is talking when the teacher's talking, that's not respectful. That's not being prepared to learn. If the child hasn't done their homework, that's not coming prepared to learn. If the child hasn't brought their pencil or their book or whatever, that's not coming prepared to learn. So everything was expressed as a positive in a general a general kind of a thread. But something like chewing gum, that would fall under um, be respectful. I think I missed one. I think it's be prepared to ask for help and offer help. Then be respect school property, respect each other, and then have fun. So I think that the chewing gum thing fell under respect school property because a lot of times children would chew gum and leave it on the ground or under the table. So that wasn't respecting school property. So anyway, so in order to have the effective and efficient classroom with the rules that you and your children have put together, you have to make sure that those rules are specific. And I know I said that they can be general, but within the generality of the rule, you can be specific. Make sure that the rules are meaningful, that they're enforceable. Don't have rules that you just can't enforce. You know, the school that I was talking about, that one of the rules that they had, the have fun, that's not an enforceable rule. So I would not have put that as part of my classroom rules, but that was what they had in their school. It's rational. It's rational. You know, you don't have rules that are just not rational. But you know, you can't go to the restroom except. Yeah, I was in a school once where the only time the children were allowed to go to the bathroom or the restroom was during the lunch break. Well, you know, how many of us can go from morning to lunch break without using the restroom? And how many of us can concentrate on what we're being taught if we need to use the restroom? So it wasn't rational. That law was not rational. And when you create a well-managed classroom, you have to do several things. First of all, you have to use valued rewards, and what I mean by that is, if you have a classroom of children who really enjoy your interaction, who enjoy having their name on the star wall, who enjoy being the student of the year or the student of the week, that is a valued reward system. There was one class, one um, school that I worked in, where most of the parents were very well off, very well off, and this teacher, for her reward system, she would give them a pencil, and it had no value for the students, you know. Plus, I don't like giving material things as a reward. I like the children to develop an intrinsic sense of achievement, like the high five, like the student of the week, like the caught you doing something good, you know, just different things that give them a sense of self-worth and self-efficacy. Make sure that you use logical and related consequences. It makes no sense for you to say because a child has acted up in class, therefore the child can't have recess. It's not related. But if you say something like, when you were supposed to be doing work in class, you were playing. So when you're supposed to be playing, you will do work. See, that's related. It's the same action. But the second one is related, whereas the first one isn't. And above all, be consistent. One of the things that can really damage you as a teacher is if you allow some students to get away with some things and then you come down hard on other students for the same exact disruptive behavior. And I know that as teachers, maybe we'll look at a child and say, well, he doesn't usually get into trouble, so I'll just let it slide. But you see, the others are watching you. And before you know where you are, you're dealing with a situation of favoritism. It's obvious that you have favorites, and children tend to act up if they feel that their teachers have favorites. Be child-centered. Be student-sensitive. Make sure your lessons are age appropriate. When you're in the younger grades, don't, unless your children are at a cognitive level where they need to be challenged. But remember the essence of rigor. Rigor is where you take them to that point where it's challenging but not frustrating. So make sure your lessons are age appropriate. Anticipate and plan for your course. You know, anticipate what's going to be needed, plan. Have sessions of open communications. Remember, I told you that when I was in the classroom, my kids, we had discussion groups. We had they're working in groups where they're talking to each other. We had mock trials. We had debates. Have sessions of open communications. Assign collaborative projects. I've talked about that before. Give them time to ask questions and give feedback. Acknowledge all raised hands. Keep track of who's participating. Remember, I told you about that classroom where one child spent the whole 90 minutes looking out of the window? and there are only a group of students, a small group of students that really paying attention, even though they're all being quiet, don't assume that because they're quiet, they're paying attention. They're not. And call on students who seem to be withdrawn or haven't spoken and give them choices. Like even when they're working in groups, I would usually say you can choose from one of these things. Even something as simple as a book report. I would write a list of book report questions and tell them they could choose 3 of those questions to answer. Children feel empowered when they're given choices. Be a skillful teacher. As a skillful teacher, explain your expectations. What are you expecting? If you haven't explained it, then you can't hold them responsible for not fulfilling those expectations. State your objectives and scaffold your learning activities. Make sure that what's needed at the bottom is solid and in place before you put something else on it. For example, if you're teaching long division and the student doesn't really understand multiplication, then you're fighting a losing battle because you cannot do long division without knowing multiplication. It's as simple as that. If you want to teach how to write a paragraph, but the student doesn't know how to write a sentence, then you're fighting a losing battle. You have to scaffold the learning activities and also provide examples. Even if you're doing centers work, the way I do, make sure in the centers you have examples. Create an active learning environment. Even if you're the type of teacher who needs students to be in their seats, you can still have an active learning environment. Give them materials to manipulate, give them things to work with. So they're not passive learners, they're active learners. Commit to constant and continuous improvement. What I used to do is I used to have on my desk all the objectives I want to cover for that year. Then along the top, I would have every child's name. And as the child has masters a particular objective, I would check it off. So periodically, I would look at that chart and see what I need to reinforce for different children. I tell all the people that I train that as teachers, you are professionals. You are diagnosticians. You are the ones that you know where the students are coming from. You know what they need to learn. You know where you want to take them. At the beginning of each year, I usually did a benchmark test. And that benchmark test would cover all the objectives that they would need to learn for the year. And that's where I would get the checks that I would check off on that chart to put on my desk. If you don't know where your children are starting off, you won't know the path you have to take to get them to where you want them to be. And that's ultimately your responsibility. Also, give constructive feedback based on ongoing assessment. Some people think that the only time they can assess is when they're doing the formal summative assessment. No, as you're going around, get into the habit of having maybe a notebook or a notepad. And as you're going around, if you observe something about a particular child, write it down so that you can do informal formative assessments. And those formative assessments can be used to help you plan how you're going to interact with this child. And I know a lot of schools, especially public schools, have large classrooms. But what you do is you break the classrooms into small units so that you can deal with a unit. Let's say if you're in a school that has, let's say, 50 students in a class, you have 5 days in a week. So if you break the students down into units of 10, I'm not saying based on their skills, I'm just saying units of 10, then at least once a week you're evaluating one group of 10 students. And then by the time you get to Friday, you've done all of them and you can move on. If you have larger groups, you may have to do it over a 2-week period. But make sure you do formative assessments and you know where the children are. Okay, we're going to stop here for a minute. I want you to your the video, and I want you to write a brief outline of how you intend to make sure your classroom is well managed. Come back. I'm hoping that you're back now. Well, we've moved on from classroom management and child-centered learning. We're now going to talk about high quality, high instructional quality. And we're going to address this from three different angles. We're going to address it from the 4 C's model of content framework and pedagogy. We're going to talk about Bloom's taxonomy, which will also talk about content and cognitive thought, and also assessment and evaluation. And then finally, we're going to talk about the SAM-R model of how you can use educational technology. Bloom's taxonomy, good old Bloom's. Bloom's taxonomy is something that was created to create a model or stratify how cognitive thought could be assessed or could be defined. And basically, as teachers, you want to start from the bottom and go all the way up to the top. So starting from the bottom, you're introducing a brand new topic, right? And you need them to remember what you've taught them. At this remembering level of cognition, the students will recognize and recall relevant knowledge. So you've taught it to them, they've had it in their short-term memory, they've moved it to their long-term memory. So when you're writing your lesson plans, you're going to use verbs like you want them to define, to duplicate, to list, memorize, repeat, reproduce. Because all you want them to do is show that they've remembered what you have taught them. But that's not enough, because it's not enough to just remember, you have to understand. And that's where a lot of students get caught up and a lot of students get lost. They remember the strategies, like especially in math, and I keep going back to math, especially in math. They'll remember the steps. They'll remember the way it's done, but they don't understand it. They don't understand why it's done that way. So if they don't do it for a while, they forget because they never understood it. So your next thing as a teacher is to move them up to this understanding. So when you're doing your lesson plan, you need to have verbs such as you want them to interpret, to exemplify, to classify, summarize, infer, compare, explain, paraphrase, discuss. You want them to develop an understanding of the topic you have just taught. But those two levels are the lower levels of cognition. They are the lower order thinking skills, remembering and understanding. And unfortunately, for most schools, this is where it stops. At the most, teachers will take them to the next level, which is for me the intermediate level, which is application. They remember, they understand. Now you want them to apply that understanding. So in your lesson, you'll use words like demonstrate, dramatize, interpret, solve, use, illustrate, convert, discover. You have discuss here, but discuss is different from the discuss in the understanding. Discuss is where they're taking what you taught and they're using that information to discuss something else. They're applying it to something else. And then prepare. So if once you get them to this point, once you're looking at your lesson plan and you've gotten them to this point, you want them to go further. You want them to go further. You want them to, this is where the critical thinking muscles kick in, you know? You want them to become critical thinkers. So at the analysis level, you want them to be able to distinguish between parts of things, how they relate to each other, to the overall structure of things, and the purpose of things. So, for example, you're going to tell them about compare and contrast, to criticize or critique, to differentiate, to discriminate, to question, to classify, to distinguish, and to experiment. One thing I do, let's say for English literature, reading, I could take two characters and tell the children to do a compare and contrast of those two characters. Or I could tell them to compare and contrast one character with themselves. Is there anything that they have in common with this character? I could tell them to critique a story. You know, at the lower levels, we could talk about not Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and we can talk about, okay, why do you think she did that? Could she have done something else? What could she have done differently? You know, if in the older kids, I could take a story of, let's say, we take the story of David Copperfield. Let's say we're doing Charles Dickens. Let's say we're talking about the story of David Copperfield, and I tell them to critique the second half of his life with the first half of his life, or compare the second half of his life with the first half of his life. I'd ask them to critique the character of his aunt compared to the character of his stepfather, you know, and we go on from there. If we're doing something like Macbeth, I could ask them to talk about the character of Lady Macbeth. Who was really the hero of that story? Who was really the villain of that story? I remember when we had when I was doing doctrine in secondary school. One of the questions that the Bible study teacher in religious studies, one of the studies the Bible study teacher gave us was, they say that Solomon was the wisest of all men. Compare his character with the character of his father. Where were they similar? Where were they different? How could they have changed the course of their own lives? That was analysis. Then once you got them to that level, you know, and you can do analysis with everything. Like if you do science and you several people have different results, you could have them compare, distinguish between, or experiment. You could have them do research and take the research findings with their own findings, or upload their findings onto an internet page and have them compare with other students in the different parts of the world. Then you have to take them to the next level. And that is a level where they have to make a judgment, a value judgment. So let me go back to Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. I said to criticize or critique the character of Lady Macbeth compared to Macbeth. But now I'm asking them to make a value judgment, appraise, argue. Was Lady Macbeth wrong in trying to spur her husband on to being all those things that had been foretold? Or was she simply trying to get him to be all that he could be? And then justify your answer. Come up with a debate. For the younger ones, you have something like the Three Bears. You could have them take Goldilocks to court, have a mock trial, you know, and have somebody represent Goldilocks, somebody represent the judge, and have a mock trial. And for the much older ones, let's say we're dealing with some really high level data that has been gleaned from international experimentation. Let them come up with their own conclusions based on the data that's presented. So you can do it, these evaluation. In fact, all of these cognitive levels, all the way from the little ones, all the way up to the top. Then you get to the pinnacle, which is creating, synthesizing. You want them to create something totally new from something that that has already been presented. So one of the things my children used to love to do was they used to love to create games. They used to love to create models. They would develop, for example, um, I gave them a challenge. If you were to build, if you wanted to build a house on Mars, what would you need? How would you do it? Design a house that would survive on Mars. And this was with an older group. This was in my middle school class, and they were the equivalent of your sixth, seventh, and eighth graders, because I had a combined classroom. But the issue is that they had to know the conditions on Mars. They had to know the conditions that would sustain human life. They had to figure out how they could up, up, upload whatever materials they needed to take to Mars and how they could create it. And then they had to justify why they created that particular living environment the way they did, and why they incorporated the materials they incorporated. For example, they know that Mars is much hotter than the Earth, so they would have to have some kind of insulation that would protect them from the heat. But they also knew that Mars did not grow anything. They couldn't grow anything on Mars. So they had to take something that they could use to grow something. So, and they had to be able to justify all of that and come up with the evaluation and analyze and apply and reuse and remember and all that good stuff in order to create that living environment on Mars. So we're talking about the cognitive domain. When you are teaching, make sure that you're not just stopping at remembering and understanding. Try and shift it all the way up to up the cognitive domain. And when you want to evaluate the learning, you're going to ask the following questions. If you want to evaluate remembering, you will ask, can the students recall or remember the information? If you evaluate understanding, you will say, can the students explain ideas or concepts? And to the right, you will see the different verbs that you can use during your evaluation. When you want to evaluate if they're able to apply the knowledge, you'll say, can the students use the information in a new way? Again, these are the verbs: choose, demonstrate, dramatize. When you want to analyze, for analysis, you say, can the students distinguish between the different parts? When you're doing evaluation, you say, can the students justify a stand or a decision? And again, when you're dealing with creation, you say, or creating, you'll say, can the students create a new product or point of view? So those are the things that you want to keep in mind when you're doing your lesson plan. We're now going to move on to the next component of our effective teaching, which is the 4C. The 4C framework is something that was initially developed by the National Education Association in 2012. And it was developed in partnership with the 21st Century Skills in 2015. And for the 4Cs, they divided all the activities into these 4 things: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. For critical thinking, you want children to be engaged in problem solving and deep analysis of concepts and reflection. So the students should solve complex problems that have multiple solutions. So you want to give them things that have open-ended solutions. So you don't want it to be a problem that has only one right answer. When you're doing that, that's not critical thinking. That's thinking, but that's not critical thinking. Ask questions and provide different points of view on an issue. So if I say, for example, in the story of the 3 little pigs, let's talk about Goldilocks. From your point of view, was she right or was she wrong? Some people might say she was right. She was hungry. She needed to eat. Survival of the fittest is the order of the jungle. It's jungle justice. Other people will say no, she was wrong because that didn't belong to her, and obviously somebody had put it there. And when I'm discussing it with them, I'm not looking for a right and wrong answer. I'm looking for a rationale. Then we have the communications. You allow public speaking. Remember, I talked about debate, discussions, mock trials. You have writing. Have them write letters, write articles, have them listen to each other. And also, you have nonverbal communication. The students should communicate through a lot of digital tools. The children we're teaching now are very different from the children we taught even 5 years ago. These children, even 2 years ago, these children, because of this pandemic, have now become more adept at using digital tools. And students should communicate with people from all over the world. Now the world is their playground. They can really literally discuss with children. So if you want, you could see if maybe you can set up a sister school project or a sister city project with different schools in different parts of the world. Collaboration, give children the ability to effectively work together, and in doing so they learn how to work with other people. I don't know if you've ever worked with someone who just does not know how to work with other people. They exist. They do exist. Give the ability to work effectively in teams and be willing to be flexible. I've worked with people who the only time they agree is if you agree with them. The minute you disagree with them, they go off into a sulk, and they consider a rejection of their idea as a rejection of them. And I say to my students in my class, in in order for us to gain from the richness of ideas and experiences that exist in a classroom, we have to be able to and willing to listen to other people's ideas and know that sometimes your ideas will be accepted and other times it won't be accepted, and you need to be fine with that. So students should work in effective collaborative teams. For example, we have a group of students all working on a geography project, and one group of students is working on the um, the, the population of that country. Another group of students is working on the trade and economics of that country. Another group of students is working on the culture of the country, and yet another group of students is working on the actual topography of the country. And then they all come together and they share their findings. Make sure that when they're working together, they have goals, and the group goals are shared by all. And when they're allowed to work together, what happens is they're allowed to work responsibly to address their own roles in the project. I don't know about you, but I really enjoy working with groups or in teams. Um, so what I want you to do is, in a few minutes, when I finish with the creativity, I want you to stop this video, and I want you to talk about what you think you as a person, what you bring to any group or any team that you work with, especially the team that you're working with right now. So creativity is the fourth thing in the four C's, and that's we've talked about that. You're allowing them to use the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and in that case, they should be encouraged to develop, analyze, elaborate, evaluate, and produce original work, not just copied work. And I remember that one of the challenges I have, or one of the struggles I have when I do this training, is that when I go into the classroom and I ask, okay, how are the children being allowed to be creative? The teacher will say, oh, they're going to draw pretty pictures. No, creativity is beyond drawing. Creativity includes music, it includes movement, it includes creating a play, creating a jingle, creating a game, inventing things. All of that fall under creativity. So, as I said, you're going to stop the video for a brief moment, and I want you to write down what you think you bring to the team that you're working on or working with right now. So, I'll see you on the other side of the break. Okay, So, as I said, let's do this again. As I said, what we're doing is, you in your 4Cs, you have critical thinking, communications, collaboration, and creativity. But the issue is they can all be incorporated, all of them, in one activity. So it's not as if you have to say, oh, I need an activity where they're going to do critical thinking, and I need another activity where they're going to communicate, and another one where they're going to, no, all of that can come into one activity. Okay, so now we're going on to the effective use of educational technology, and you really, really, really need to have this, because if you don't understand this, then all you'll be doing is using S, the substitution, and that is like having a beautiful Rolls Royce or a beautiful high-end car, and just driving it from work to work, from work to work, where you could go off on the street and you could explore the nation. So let's talk about your SAM-R model. The SAM-R model is a model of is a way that examines how technology is used in education. Basically, that's what it is. And if you think of it as two parts, you have the lower part, which is the S and the A, and the upper part, which is the M and the R. And if you see the arrow that's going up, similar to Bloom's taxonomy, what you want, you can start with the S, and most of us do start with the S. S means substitution. That means you're using technology as a substitute, as a replacement for tools that you would normally use in the classroom. So instead of children using pencil and paper, you have them use the Word program, and you have them write notes on a tablet. So there's nothing new that you have adapted. And that's fine. That's because that happens. We all do it. The next one is augmentation. Augmentation, you need to take that direct substitute and you need to add a degree of functionality. So they're taking the notes that they would normally take down pencil and paper. They've used the Word program to put it on their tablet or on their laptop. And then you're asking them to incorporate something like an image that they will capture from the internet. So that's, you've given them some degree of functionality. Sorry, let me go back. Sorry. Then the M is modification. Modification is when technology allows you to use to do a task and significantly redesign it. For example, using a software to create and share to a larger audience. So they take these notes that they've taken down using substitution with the incorporated digital image using augmentation. They're now going to use a software and they're going to share it with a larger audience, maybe with their Google Classroom or with their sister city. That is modification. That's something they couldn't do without technology. And then redefinition is the highest level. This is where the student does a task that's totally redesigned. So they've taken the story they've written with the Word program, with the images that they have placed in it using capture, maybe screen capture. Then they want to share it. But in the process, they are going to animate. They're going to animate these images, and they're going to use the animation as a animated video that tells the same story that they wrote in their Word document. And they would not have been able to do this without redefinition. So technology is just, as I said, simply using what you would normally use pencil and paper for. Augmentation is when you have you're enhancing that task with technology, but you're not really changing the task. Substitution and augmentation allows you to enhance. Enhancement does not necessarily increase learning. It increases efficiency, but not learning. It does not transform your learning. It's the last two, the modification and redefinition that transforms your learning. It allows them to do a new thing, a new method, a new form of learning. So as I said, transformation occurs above the line. I've talked about it allows you to significantly redesign, and redefinition enables you to totally redefine the task. The thing you need to understand is even though the arrow goes up, it's actually a looping arrow. Sometimes you're going to use substitution, sometimes you're going to use redefinition, sometimes you'll come back and use augmentation. It's not a progressive thing. It's all the way along. You can use it all the way. It's a looping arrow. Okay, and that is where we'll stop, and I will come back to you at a later date and do the part 2 of creating and maintaining high instructional quality.